Welcome everyone to this very special episode of Energy Tonight with Max Rice and Ryan Dickey. Today we are interviewing someone very special to my heart, my father, Mark Rice.
Hello, everybody.
Thanks
So Mark, if you would just start off by telling the audience a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so I'm a born and bred Texan who comes from family business, mostly the energy business. My family moved to Texas back in the late 1800s to follow the oil market, which went from essentially the East Coast, and they found oil in Texas. And my family, along with a lot of other oil families, moved to Texas. So I was really born and raised in Fort Worth, Texas, and then Houston, Texas, and primarily growing up in the energy business. So back then, of course, there was no such thing as deregulated energy, but I was in the oil and gas business and some of the derivatives from crude oil and natural gas we would make into specialty chemicals, and been doing that my whole life. And I've married a nice girl from Chicago. So I live in Chicago now for the last, 30 years or so, and have 4 kids, including Max, and 2 other boys, in fact, who all 3 of them work with Ryan and Max in Energy CX, of which I'm very proud. And I think your audience probably knows what Energy CX is, so I don't want to bother about that. But still, through Energy CX, I'm very involved in the energy business. So that's a little bit about me, Ryan.
So how was it like? So it's kind of weird that you had energy in several parts of your family, isn't that correct?
Yeah.
On your mom and your dad's
true.
side. So
That's true.
How was that seeing different sides of the energy industry?
Well, so something that's unique about me that people might find a little bit interesting is my one side of my family was in the cattle business. They were from Texas, and they married my grandfather, who was in the oil business, as I explained before. So with the cattle side of the business, or the ag side of the energy business, back in the day when oil was so very cheap, I mean, it was pennies a gallon or even pennies a barrel. It was almost like a waste product. In fact, some of the derivatives of oil, like gasoline, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, were waste. Were byproducts to make the heating oil that they were using to heat and so forth. So anyway, in ag, and I look at this different than maybe a lot of people do, but when you look at ag, which before we discovered oil and uses of oil, we were using ag products to make heat and to make energy, right? So we would take the different vegetables and squeeze the oil out of them, like the soybean oil from beans or the corn oil from corn, et cetera. Or take the animal fat, like lard from pigs and tallow from cattle, and even schmaltz, they call it, from chickens, and use that oil to burn that. Peanuts, diesel oil was actually founded but it was Otto Diesel. I don't know if you know this history, but Otto Diesel discovered diesel fuel, and it wasn't a derivative of petroleum or of crude oil from under the ground. It was a derivative of peanuts. It was peanut oil that they used to make.
Never knew that.
It was biodiesel?
So the first diesel was biodiesel, actually. That's correct. But what's happened is, once we discovered oil, and it was so very plentiful in places like Texas, where it was just coming out of the ground, it was cheaper than these other things. So it replaced all of these other things, these other natural, reoccurring, as we say now, green, sustainable forms of energy. That's all we had before we discovered oil, right? And my family was involved in that business on the ag side. And then another side of my family was involved in the business from the petroleum side. And they married, and they literally, my grandfather went into business with his brother-in-laws who were on the ag side. So he built a chemical plant, or a petroleum plant. It was in fact called Petrochemical Company. That was the name of it. And he built it right next to the meatpacking plant that his in-laws had. And they partnered together. So they would take the fat from the animals, which were cattle. They would usually slaughter them over the weekend, and they would then take all the tallow. And by the way, the tallow from a cow and the lard from a pig, depending on where you are and the weather and other factors, it can be as much as half the animal. So half of an animal half the value of an animal is this fat. And we still eat it. That's what margarine is, and shortening, and all kinds of, animal byproducts that go into different foods, but it also has a nice energy source. Now, when I was very young, even when I was young, so even in like the 70s and 80s, oil was still so cheap that although everybody knew about the energy uses of those products, it wasn't economical. It was more economical just to take the oil out of the ground and use that for fuel because it was so cheap. Well, now fast forward 50 years, and obviously oil we know it's not sustainable. We know that it's not, reproducing itself. We also know now, and we didn't know 100 years ago so much about the harm to the environment that some of those things have. And of course, the non-sustainability of all of that. Now we're looking at all of these sustainable forms of energy, which are really the same things that I grew up doing and that my family was doing. And so I would say, just by nature, I was placed in a spot where I was at the nexus between renewable energy and the old energy, working in both spaces. So I've created a company and have created several companies over my lifetime, but most have been involved in some way, shape, or form in that. And for example, the parent company of Energy CX is actually called Biofuels Technology, which is something I started, I guess, in the late 90s, I believe. And that was primarily focused just on as the name, says, biofuels. So we were mostly dealing with derivatives of biodiesel. So that's sort of my take on this whole thing, as we're headed in that direction. And as oil has dramatically dropped recently, I think that's going to put a slowdown on it. But over the last decade or two, you've seen really dramatic growth rates in terms of people looking for other forms of energy other than petroleum. And of course, the cheapest kilowatt, for example, that you can make, the most economical way to make a kilowatt is to not use it in the first place, right? So all the efficiencies and all of the devices and services, products, innovative things that people have made to allow us to use power a lot more efficiently.
Can you speak to how Energy CX transitioned from refining biodiesel to energy degradation, that whole journey?
Well, I mentioned I come from Texas, and we all know that's really where deregulation of the power grid started. So I tell people who are from other states that, they, like this state, Illinois, we're big into corn and big into soybeans, and even the trading markets here in Chicago, the Mercantile Exchange and the Board of Trade, et cetera, are big industries. Growing up in Texas, the industry is power. I mean, oil and gas and power is the main industry for the state of Texas. I may be wrong, but at least it certainly was, and it's massively important in places like Houston, Texas, and other energy centers like that. And that's where I grew up. So it was just my nature to kind of know very early about the deregulation and the opportunities that provides for people. And a lot of times when we're talking to people who are just coming into our industry and they don't know anything about it, I mention to them, the whole idea of what you do for a living often is that you should have a purpose. I mean, whether it's with your family or anything, that we're all purpose driven. And at some point in our lives, we certainly want to hope and think and believe that we have a purpose in life. And maybe we believe in a God, or maybe we don't. But whether we do or not, we usually are driven by doing the greater good. Something along the lines of helping others, helping the environment, helping the world, helping our family, helping ourselves, right? It's just instinctual, I think, in all of us. And so I believe that I didn't get here by accident, that I happen to be placed in the world, in the situation, and that there's massive transformation going on to make the world a better place. And we're trying to play a small role in that. And the deregulation that started in Texas is really, I think, the linchpin of all the innovation that we see. Because before the markets were deregulated, if they were regulated and all there were utilities that were in the energy space, for example, in the power space, but the same holds true with gas utilities and things like that. If there wasn't deregulation, there'd be really nothing but government-controlled efforts to innovate, which, as we know, isn't really where innovation comes from. It comes from the private sector, driven by capitalism, and I'm a big believer in capitalism. And so once they deregulated energy, not only is it a chance to save our customers money and to make really nice livings for the people that we help engage in it, from creating residual income. I mean, that's all just wonderful. But I believe a deeper purpose, aside from all of that, is that we're helping these very large deregulated companies and even regulated companies to spur the innovation that we see, which I see innovation happening at a rate that is something along the lines of what happened with the internet or what happened with the automobile when it was invented, things like that. I think we'll look back decades from now and say, oh my, can we believe what was going on at that time? So here we are in that period of time. And yes, I was mostly doing biodiesel at one point, wasn't yet in the energy deregulated power and gas space. But I saw this giant disconnect between consumers and all the innovation that was happening. So there's all this innovation with unbelievably smart people from Silicon Valley to other countries, to Israel, to New York, to everywhere. And yet consumers aren't aware of it. They're even skeptical of it a lot of times because there's some bad actors out there and a lot of snake oil types of products and services. And I found that there's a great need for somebody to fill that gap, to connect consumers to all that's going on, not just to better the world and to better their neighborhood and to allow them to be healthier, to breathe cleaner air and these kinds of things. And also, of course, to have, I skipped over the fact that, we were dependent on foreign oil. And unfortunately, a lot of that foreign oil, it's crazy if you look at where it is. It's under people that want to kill us or certainly don't like us, don't like our way of living, don't like the fact that we don't believe in their religion or their gods or their laws and things like that. And yet they control most of the natural resources that we were and still are consuming. And so all of this effort that we're doing helps create national security, which I think is a great, noble, and purpose-driven thing. So all the people out there that are listening to this that are either in our industry or thinking of going into our industry, I feel that a big part of what we are doing is helping our national security, as I'm talking about, and helping the greater good, helping, create in Yiddish, or actually I'm a Jewish guy. We have a saying called Tikkun Olam, which is a thousands of year old Judeo-Christian principle, which is to repair the world. And we're commanded to do that. Now, you may believe in God or not, and that's fine. But I think we all believe that that's a noble thing to do. That's a good thing to do. And I feel really good about that. And I hope that most people that are in our industry or thinking of going into our industry can connect those dots, that they're trying to help the world, create a greater good. They're helping with all of this innovation. These are the more purpose-driven thoughts that I have on why we do what we do. I don't know. Does that resonate with you, Ryan or Max? Do you guys ever think of that? Yeah.
It's huge. And I think, our industry gets, an inaccurate, I guess we're inaccurately represented by some of these actors that you mentioned, when there are good folks out there who are really trying to bridge the gap between, the consumer and the innovation that you just discussed. So, that definitely resonates with me. And I definitely have some frustrations around states who have been so opposed to deregulating, who are just widening that gap between the innovation and the consumer. When, a lot of times the reason for that may be, okay, these companies are just looking to fatten their pockets, right? When they may be overlooking the potential benefit for the consumer. So I think we are doing a very good thing as energy professionals by being a part of that initiative. And yeah, like I said, that definitely resonates with me, and it's important to me in what I do.
Yeah, what's amazing about all that purpose-driven activities and thoughts that I'm talking about, what's amazing to me is a lot of times before I got into this business, for example, I was a trader, at the Mercantile Exchange in Chicago. That's why I moved here, and I had a very successful career. And actually, when I first had Max, In fact, I got married while I was a trader, and we had a baby. And once we had a baby, I started thinking to myself, I would go to the floor every morning at like 6:30. I would check my out trades. That's a crazy thing. Anyway, then the market would open at 7:20, and we would have the ability. I don't want to say that I would do this often, but we would often have the ability to make outsized monies, and sort of beyond your imagination sometimes. So I'd make all this money, and sometimes I would lose money as well. Don't get me wrong. But I actually had a television talk show. I don't know if I ever told you that. I had
It's great.
a show.
I didn't. I'm learning a lot about you today, Mark.
I had this show on Channel 26 back then. It was called WCIU, which was the channel back then. There was internet sort of, but there was really almost no internet. And to get stock quotes, you had to watch TV, and you could see the ticker tape go along the bottom. And that was the Chicago station that had the stock quotes. And then they would have. So I had a show called Ask an Expert, and it was about making money in the markets. And I've had a hedge fund. I skipped that over, but I've had a hedge fund for over 20 years.
And the football program, you skipped it over.
Yeah, I've done a bunch of, I've had a lot of, I'm an entrepreneur, right? So I've done a lot of things. But I still have the hedge fund. And so my point at talking about that I was a trader and that I was trading to make money, and you could make a crazy living, and you could start at 7:20 in the morning and sometimes be done by 8 o'clock in the morning and go play golf. That was actually a common thing for traders. Like, let's say you could make 10 grand in a day. You might say to yourself, well, if I can make $10,000 a day times 200 days, that's a very nice living, and that's enough. I don't want to take the risk that I need to take to make more than $2 million a year. So if I make 10 grand a day, I leave. Because if you leave, you can't give it back, right? So there were a lot of traders that would, maybe for some traders, it was 1,000 a day. For others, it might've been 100,000 a day, but everybody had a number. And if you had a good opening, and the opening of a lot of markets like the currencies and some of the ags like meat and pork bellies. Matter of fact, by the way, the reason I moved to Chicago, I don't know if you understand this, Max, is I was working in my family's oil and gas business, and I actually lived in Haiti along the way, running a shortening manufacturing plant, which was making derivatives from the lard that we were talking about. And rather than burning it, we were making it into shortening that we sold all over Central and the America and the Caribbean. But anyway, my grandfather, being in that oil and gas business, he would chart things by hand back then. There was no internet. And so we would keep pieces of paper and every day take the high, low, and close and make charts. And so we were doing some trading. And so I got into trading. And then of course, Chicago is where the trading was. And my grandfather had bought the Mercantile Exchange, which is now, it's really the Board of Trade and Mercer together. I think they call the whole thing the Mercantile Exchange. But originally it was just the Chicago Merc, the CME. It started out as the Eggs and Butter Exchange. I don't know if you guys would know that. That was,
never knew that.
They just traded eggs and butter. That was it.
So CME started out as the Eggs and Butter Exchange.
Eggs and butter.
And eggs and butter was it bread and butter?
It was, well, that was it. Some of these other, for instance, one of the biggest commodities now there are the bonds and the S&Ps and things like that. They didn't exist back then. So yeah, it was eggs and butter, and eggs was a big commodity. It still is a big commodity. We all consume eggs, or most people do, and butter as well. Now back then, butter was really just for eating. Now butter, if you think about it, is also for energy. So for example, well, anyway, so the Eggs and Butter Exchange, they still trade butter to this day, although I think it's just a wink at the past. They do it, I think, once a week. They ask if anybody wants to trade. When I was down there, they would go, any trading in butter? And people could go over and technically trade, but it rarely did. But anyway, what's interesting about butter, or about shortening, or about lard, or about tallow, or about soybean oil, those are actually bigger markets, soybean oil and corn oil and canola oil, all the oil complex, is that if those products trade down to a level that on a BTU basis, you understand what BTU basis is, right?
Yeah.
People here understand that? That basically the cost to heat a gallon of water, right? To get it up to boiling point. If the cost to do that using soybean oil ever gets cheaper than crude oil or gasoline or kerosene or diesel, then people switch over. It's just natural. So for instance, we used to serve, for example, biodiesel plants that made biodiesel from soybean oil. I remember one called Incobrasa from Brazil. And you would go there and they had the big crush plant where they take the beans from ADM or Cargill or whoever, and they crush them and they make it into oil. And then you have the mill as well. And so I grew up trading that spread, the meal oil spread, which they call the crush. Because you take a bean is worth X and its two products are meal and oil, and that's got to be worth X plus a little bit. Because if not, nobody would bother to crush the bean to make the meal and oil in the first place. There'd be a negative margin to do that. I hope I'm not talking too technical, but anyway, that's called the crush.
That's great, yeah.
And I used to trade that. And so if, for example, if the crush spread would ever go negative, and actually more germane to this audience would be the petroleum crack spread. And the crack is crude oil. You would buy crude oil and then sell unleaded petroleum and heating oil against that. And you could basically take a gallon or a barrel of oil and sell exactly in proportion the products coming from that, the gas, not the natural gas, but the unleaded, petroleum and the heating oil, so that you were capturing exactly what a refiner is. That is exactly what a refiner does. They buy the crude oil and they make it into the derivatives and they sell the derivatives. If they can't sell the products from the feedstock for more, then they lose money. And they don't do that for very long. They don't really do that for a day. They would shut the plant down. It would make no sense to stay in operation and lose money every moment. So those kinds of things are a little bit more predictable than just the price of oil or the price of gas as we're doing, because that spread has to be somewhat positive. So if, for example, the spread would ever go crazy high, you could short the spread because more refiners would pop up, or refiners would manufacture at high capacity. Instead of going 12 hours a day, they'd go 24. And then, and vice versa. Of course, if the margin went negative, you'd see refiners close down and the spread would come back. So these were predictable things to trade and something that I made a living. But getting back to my point of purpose is, so as I was trading and I had enough, knowledge to make a nice living doing it, I didn't feel much of a purpose, right? It was kind of like going to a casino. Let's say you became really good at blackjack, and maybe you could count cards or something, and you had a little bit of an edge, and you could go do that and make money, and you made good money, and you could, to me there's a certain emptiness in that kind of a. Now people will say, well, you could then take the money that you make and build hospitals and orphanages and help so many people. And there's a lot of truth to that, but the activity itself, to me, was very hollow and empty. Whereas what we're doing here, repairing the world, as I said, and helping so many people to make a great living selling energy, helping our customers to going from getting ripped off or just taken advantage of so many times, and really taking good care of them and saving them so much money, lowering their costs. Especially now with all this COVID stuff. I mean, who doesn't want to lower their cost as best they can for something that, there's no differential in it in terms of quality. So I feel like we're very purpose driven with what we do now as to what I was doing before, doing the day-to-day, trading stuff.
Yeah, no, very, very interesting. And I'd like to go back to the topic of innovation, because someone, like yourself, being in the industry your whole career, for the most part, you've seen that innovation, you've witnessed that innovation, and it seems like you're kind of on the forefront of, where the industry is going. So if you had to single out one major thing in the industry, the one major innovation that you're seeing in the industry right now, what would that be?
So I used to tell people, I mentioned I started I have a hedge fund for all these years. When I first started it, it was the beginning of the internet. And I was a very early adopter to the internet. I was a bit of a computer nerd, they called us back then. I actually had my first computer was a TRS-80, which they called a Trash 80, which older people might remember, because it was one of the first personal computers. That was a big deal for a person to be able to buy their own computer. That was like an amazing thing back when we could do that. And I was able to get one. You had a computer, massive, computer, but you also had for storage, it was a cassette recorder. You had a separate cassette recorder with wires, and the storage was on a cassette, and it was measured in kilobytes, not megabytes. It was a tiny amount of storage. But anyway, so when the internet finally came along and we could connect these computers, and I could talk to people over a computer, and I could get information from around the world, it was just an amazing thing. So I really went all in and started a hedge fund or investment fund to invest in and help create a lot of internet companies. And we got very lucky with that. It was also, it was a lucrative thing, and it worked out very well. But along the way, I became a student, and to a very small extent, I participated in all of the innovation that was going on with the internet, whether it was the creation of the internet itself, or the hardware to make it go, or the software, and all the B2B and B2C kinds of things that went on, all the analytics, all the security. I was very immersed. In fact, my fund was called the dotcom fund. And so I was in Forbes, and, I was in some of the newspapers. And
Now I'm learning all kinds of things about you today. You've been holding back on me, Mark.
It's funny. Some of it doesn't show up on Google, but I got some press back then. Maybe it was mostly because the name of my fund was the dotcom fund. People didn't even know what it was at the time. I was very early in it. And so I was able to attract a lot of capital, and we invested it, and you almost couldn't lose because it went crazy and worked out really well. But there were also, just as there is today, in this unbelievably disruptive technology called the internet, which changed the world, right? There were good actors and bad actors. There were people with great ideas that failed, and great ideas and even bad ideas that succeeded. I mean, all kinds of things. And I learned through that experience what it's like to disrupt a whole massive industry, and what happens, all the good and the bad. And I see the whole thing as really the same thing that's going on in our energy space here, where we're very early in it. I tell people we're still in the first or second inning of this, as when I got into the dot-com space, into the internet space, that was also very early. We didn't have Google. We didn't have, it was so funny back then. You guys are so young, but like you would go on the internet, like today we're streaming video. That was, of course, unheard of. That, people didn't even believe that would ever happen. We didn't believe that was possible. And there were companies at the beginning of that, some of which I invested in. In fact, YouTube, one of my friends is the founder. Anyway, I've good friends and I
MySpace,
helped,
right?
Yeah, I was, I got involved very early in a lot of really innovative companies like that. And usually at the beginning, people are laughing at you, and they think you can't succeed, and they think you're crazy and so forth. But anyway, I see a lot of that same psychology, both investor psychology, consumer psychology, media, and so forth, treating our, energy innovation space, which I call clean tech, to the same way that they did the internet space back then. And I think that's where we are. We're in whoever is going to be Google of this energy, of not just renewable energy, but just energy in general, whoever are going to be the Amazon and the Google, what do they call them?
The FANG, right?
The FANGs,
yeah,
the FANGs,
yeah.
Facebook, Apple,
Amazon, Netflix,
Netflix, Google, yeah.
Google.
Whoever that is in energy, I don't think even one of them has presented itself yet. They may be out there.
Really?
Maybe a guy in their garage.
So even Tesla.
Tesla's got a shot. I take it back. Yeah, Tesla has a shot at being one of those. But really, when people think of Tesla, and we all drive Teslas, all three of us, and are very involved in Tesla, they still think about the EVs. They don't think so much about the solar side of the business, the solar city piece, and all the innovation that's going on there. And if you talk to analysts like a Goldman Sachs, and Goldman just came up with a buy, I believe, this week on Tesla, or they raised their target, something that became positive. And when you look at their models going forward, even the analysts who are Harvard MBA smart, financial analysts, they're not putting much credence into the numbers that Tesla's going to produce I'm talking about in the next, 10 years on the side of their business that's not EV, that's renewable energy, solar roofs and so forth, batteries. I mean, we've sold, a several $1 million project to a customer that included a big portion of that was Tesla batteries. We know that, as a small group here, but I don't think that the world understands the potential of Tesla in terms of the everything else aside from the EV market, because cars are sexier and more exciting, and people want to hear about that, but they don't even really look too much into that, give too much credence to that, which probably would be a good reason that they brought Solar City in, if you think about it, because Solar City was trading at nothing, and people thought they were going to go out of business. And Elon brought Solar City into Tesla to save it, and because the EV side of the business seemed to have more potential. And if nothing else, as two publicly traded companies, Tesla stock had a much, much higher valuation than Solar City. And that's because people are more interested in solar cars than they are solar power. It's just because it seems more accessible to them. And that's why I say we're still in the first inning. The people just don't connect the solar power and renewables and all of the things that are going on in the clean tech space. They're not connected with it, which is precisely the role that our company is trying to play in trying to connect consumers to all of those products and services, which maybe they don't understand and maybe they don't trust because they've seen something on the internet, but they're absolutely real. They're innovating at a pace that's, beyond anything, the growth in all the innovation, and then the bipartisan nature of the support behind it globally and even in this country. It's one of the only things that the state of Illinois or that the federal Congress, for example, have voted to support. And so it's going to continue, and yet people just don't know about it. And I'm not so sure that how the internet interfaces with everybody. We're using it right now as we speak. But when people use their power, they just kind of don't want to know about it. They just want to know that when they turn the light switch on, that the light somehow happens. They don't really want to know how it's generated and transmitted and how it's charged and paid for. They really don't. So I'm not so sure that the energy clean tech innovation that's going on will be like the internet, where consumers get intimately involved with it. They're engaging with the internet every day. We all are now. With email is the internet. Everything that we do with the internet, we're all engaging with it. And yet on the energy space, I believe that perhaps even for decades to come, people are still, it's going to be a set it and forget it mentality. They want the innovation to happen, but they don't want to get intimately involved with it. And so how does it happen? Well, you need people like us in the middle to connect the dots, right? To connect people with all the innovation. So guess what? I named the company Energy Connection. That's where the whole idea came from. It's to connect people to all this innovation and to energy in a way that would benefit them, not just benefit the world and benefit the global warming and national security and all of those things, but benefit them economically immediately. And as we I'm sure you guys talk about it, no cost typically. I'm big on the idea of trying to financially engineer it in such a way so that people don't have to pay for it, and it comes out of the savings, and therefore they have a net positive from the beginning.
You've been very outspoken about, like, as you mentioned on the internet, like how there's a lot of good actors, but also bad actors.
Yeah.
And you've been very outspoken against bad actors in energy, and even helped create the Energy Professionals of Illinois.
Well, you too, yeah.
Yeah, no, you led the way.
Yeah, Max.
No,
yeah.
My question for you
Yeah.
is, what's your advice to consumers on how to spot a energy product that's too good to be true? Because we see things all the time that's just, this little device will, like,
Yep.
how do you spot a bad actor in the industry?
Well, in our industry, in particular, the brokerage side, the procurement, what we call procurement, that's the selling of gas and power to consumers. We primarily focus at Energy CX in commercial customers who typically are more sophisticated and are a little bit, at least more interested in cost savings, for example, than a residential customer, like say a housewife or somebody that maybe doesn't have a regular business. They're just taking care of their house, and energy just goes far beyond what they understand. So what we've seen is on the commercial side of things that where we engage is the deals are frankly large enough because they're multiple times the volume on the commercial side than they are the residential side. So a commercial customer on average is several times the usage of a residential customer on average, not always, but on average. So therefore, there's enough margin available to compensate people on the commercial side to do procurement in such a way that they can make sometimes millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands, or at least, a really nice living. On the residential side, because the volumes are so much lower, there's not that much margin, right? So the only way to create margin if you're in the residential space off of a tiny account is to increase the margin on that account. And the only way to do that, I feel often what happens is a little bit of a shady, dishonest way to do it. So they will do something misleading or deceptive, or just even upfront charge people a rate that's so very high, higher than what they should be paying, higher than what even the utility would charge, and that creates enough margin so that somebody can make money. I mean, to illustrate that, if somebody lives in an apartment and their bill is $30 a month, how in the world can somebody sell that customer and make more than $30? There's just not enough money out of $30 a month. Well, supposedly to save the money, but so anyway, what we have seen is in the residential space especially, there's a lot of misleading, deceptive business practices going on, primarily by MLMs, of which there are many, and also door-to-door street teams. But this is no different than the snake oil salesman back in the early 1900s. There's always bad actors in any industry. And in our industry, unfortunately, we have our share. I don't know that we have any more of our share than other industries, but as somebody in the industry, we of course hate it. And we do everything we can to stop it and to self-police ourselves. And Max and myself have helped start in the state of Illinois a association to do just that, to represent energy suppliers and brokers, to monitor the industry, monitor the behavior of others, and try to help the industry to cleanse itself of some of that. And unfortunately, even business customers are also residential customers because they live somewhere, and many people have fallen prey to, or have at least seen or know somebody that has fallen into one of these misleading situations where they ended up paying a lot more for their power than they should have, and it leaves them with a really bad taste in their mouth. And so they, even though we of course have nothing to do with that at all, they still are gonna it's just something that when they think of us or our industry, it also affects us. So we really need to do everything we can to try to clean that up, and to communicate to business owners that we work with, and even residential customers, that there are good people out there that do take care of their customers, that do have their customers' best interest in mind, not their own best interest in mind. And that's really what we're all about.
Agreed.
Yeah, you guys agree with that?
Yeah, so if we have any viewers who want to get more information on Energy Connection, where should they go?
Yeah, so Energy CX, which that's our logo, is just energycx.com, right? Is that the
check
best
it out.
place?
And also we got a Facebook.
Go to our
Instagram.
website. We're growing quite a bit, Ryan, as you know. I think last year we grew over 50%. Our growth rate's quite high, and we're one of the larger people in the country that do what we do, which is, we are not a supplier. We do not have our own brand of power or gas, and therefore we're agnostic as to which gas suppliers or power suppliers, or for that matter, solar developers or solar panel manufacturer, light bulb, LED manufacturers and contractors. We're agnostic as to all of that. We really work on the side of the consumer. Typically, it's a commercial consumer, not a residential consumer, but we have our interests are completely aligned with theirs. So as we say, we're on their side of the negotiating table rather than the suppliers of these things. And we're growing, and we're always looking for people to join us. And in fact, we have you guys aren't so involved in it, but we have 3 or 4 people here who that's all they do. Nathan and Will primarily. They help recruit and train other people that want to join us, either from industry or outside of industry, to make some either, serious life-changing income and a full-time job, salary job, all the way to independent contractor residual income, which can range anywhere from, we have people that make, like, what do I call it? Mailbox money. They get $100 a month or $1,000 a month. It's not meaningful.
Yeah,
It's not meaning. Well, it still is nice, but we have people that take it very non-seriously, but they're helping others, and hopefully they feel good about what they're doing, and they make a little money for doing it. And maybe they don't really, they spend an hour a year doing it.
An hour every 3 years.
But then we have other people who do it full time and make at least 6 figures, if hopefully not 7 figures, helping bigger customers and or a lot of customers, and probably engage in it, a lot more, do it, probably full time. And so we're always looking to bring people in. If people see this and want to do that, give us a call or look at our website, energycx.com, and join us.
Well, thank you so much. I got a bunch of questions I got to ask you when the camera's off.
When the camera's on?
No, I'm kidding. No, that was an awesome time. Thank you so much.
Was that okay?
Yeah,
That was great. And energycx.com is the website. Thank you, everyone, for your time. And we will see you next week or tomorrow. Who knows?
Okay, thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for everything you do. Appreciate it.